So,
All right.
adaptation to injury, not rehabilitation. This is a quote that came from a book that I just finished titled How We Learn to Move by Rob Gray, he has a PhD in experimental psychology. He's from the Arizona State University. Pretty big name in motor learning and motor control. And I first heard about him from the E3 Rehab podcast and loved what he had to say, so I decided to buy a couple of his books. Yeah, so I just finished one of the books, and I thought it was excellent. And this is towards the end of his book, where he has a section in a chapter about adaptation to injury, not rehabilitation. And I just wanted to quote something from that part of the book. Quote, I really think we should switch to using the term adaptation to injury instead of injury rehabilitation or recovery. Why? Rehabilitation or recovery implies that the way that we should deal with injury is by trying to get back to where we were before it happened. To me, this idea is flawed and counterproductive because I think it is impossible. And then he quotes another popular quote that really sums it up pretty well, which is, you can never step in the same river twice. This shift in thinking, well, I don't think it's new. It's fairly new to me. Not in words, but in idea, where like the older I've gotten, the more I've done this, the more I've begun to shift my thought around. The science doesn't really support us getting people totally back to how things were, because the injuries stick with you. You have them forever. You know, Eric and I talk about this all the time, where if you have low back pain, for example, you are more likely to have it again in the future. And so it becomes less of curing your low back pain and more about managing it. And I think that this adaptation to injury perspective and not rehabilitation just has a lot of just really good thoughts behind it.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. I feel like it's something that yourself or, probably a lot of people in PT, we do this or we think about it like this, in terms of how we treat patients, but I don't think there's like a name put to it, right? And so when you sent me this, I was reading it and I'm like, oh yeah, this makes sense. Like this, I feel like this is something that we do inherently, or at least, I think a good chunk of us do, but we didn't have a name put to it, right? And so this idea of adaptation, and I really like that quote from it. Like you said, you can't step in the same river twice. Which even makes me, this might be going off on a little tangent right away in the podcast, but like it makes me think even like non-injury related. Like I have some patients right now who are 13, 15, 16 years old, etc. And they're growing like crazy. I think that's definitely part of the reason why their movement patterns, motor control, etc. are just off the charts kind of weird, because they're teenagers and they're growing like weeds. And so even out of injury, like let's say that they don't even have pain anywhere. It's like they're, month to month, week to week, whatever time frame you want to use, as their body grows, their joints are new joints, I guess, if you want to look at it that way. Maybe not that extreme, but like their anatomy is changing, not drastically, but it's changing as they grow. And so even for them, they can't, quote, step in the same river twice. So I think it's a good idea to be open about, or to think about, just in terms of rehab and fitness programming, because the body is constantly changing, regardless of injury.
Yeah, and that example about kids growing like weeds fits nicely with one of the major concepts in motor learning, which is the constraints-led approach. It's a form of coaching where you try to have people self-discover different ways of moving, and as the coach, you're trying to make that self-discovery happen by putting in constraints, putting in different guardrails around these different things you want them to do. And one of the areas that you can constrain, or where I should say people are constrained, is with their own anatomy, their own individual performance, where the movements that you do and how you do them are in part dictated by your own body, your own strength, your own endurance, your own limb lengths. And so an 8-year-old is going to accomplish a task very different than that same person who is now 12 years old when their bones are longer. They have different potential to move. That's really it. And so all those things are definitely relevant for how someone chooses to move, and certainly relevant to how they get injured.
I would agree with that. So yeah, going on from all that, talking about, I know we discussed a little bit before the podcast, Christian, on this excerpt that you sent me, and the author discusses how calling it rehab or recovery is counterproductive. It sounded like he takes a pretty strong stance on this, right? Didn't leave a lot of room for, I guess, discussion with this. He's like, yeah, it's counterproductive to call something recovery or rehab from an injury versus like adaptation to an injury, because again, kind of going back to the idea, you can't step in the same river twice. He talks about how this is kind of an impossible feat. You know, if you have a pretty nasty injury, let's say it's a pretty nasty shoulder, like rotator cuff injury, and it's like, well, that shoulder, the idea is that, like, well, you can't recover or rehab it back to quote normal. It's never going to be the same again. Like, this is an impossible thing that we're trying to do. And that's something that I want to break down a little bit more and and go into the weeds a little bit of it. Like we said, there's a lot of things in healthcare and the fitness realm that's not always just so black and white, and that there's a lot of gray area. And so I think this is a good point to discuss that gray area. And I think we have similar thoughts on this. So I think with like larger injuries, if you blew out your rotator cuff, right? Like you tore infraspinatus subscapularis and, you know, you need rotator cuff repair surgery and you're going through the recovery. The shoulder's probably not going to be the same even after surgery from what it was pre-injury. Let's say you have subacromial pain syndrome, you know, or like you're getting like a long head biceps tendinopathy or something like that going on. And like I would argue that, yeah, like maybe that like subacromial pain syndrome diagnosis is, you could probably get it back pretty dang close, if not back to quote normal where it was before the pain set on, versus like the rotator cuff injury. Yeah, I think this idea applies very well to it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think, like anything, I don't think it's all black and white. I think that the adaptation to injury perspective is going to exist on a spectrum where I think more mild injuries, like you said, the subacromial pain syndrome or the bicep tendon thing, yeah, it's probably more realistic to think about this truly as recovery or rehab because there's fewer things involved, meaning fewer muscular structures or tendinous structures. There's fewer areas of the brain involved, which I'll get into in a moment. And those you can probably think about as recovery. Like, let's just get that bicep stronger. Let's get that tendon stronger. Chances are it's going to feel a bit better. Whether or not it truly got stronger, it still gets better. Then you have more major injuries, like you said, rotator cuff tears, labral tears, which truly alter the function of several body regions, not just the labrum or the rotator cuff tendon or muscle, but the scapular mechanics, your shoulder joint mobility. It affects your brain, how you process movement, how you sense movement, all these different things. And a major one where a ton of research is done in is going to be ACL tears and ACL surgeries. And that's actually one of the things that was cited in this chapter in the book, which was, it was a study titled Functional Brain Plasticity Associated with ACL Injury, a scoping review of current evidence from 2019. And I read this study, and I read an extra study that had even more citations than this one, actually from the JOSPT, the PT journal that we love and read so much.
Every day. Don't miss it.
Every day. Every
morning coffee. JOSPT.
Read to my kids at night that I don't have yet, but yeah. All right. So there was a quote from this study, and I'll break it down after this, but it says, quote, "The disrupted sensory input following ACL injury together with nociceptor activity related to the inflammatory process is likely to contribute to changes in the somatosensory feedback." Jesus, that was a lot. My God. What that's saying is that there's a lot of key structures or things involved. So like, your ACL, for example, it's not just this like useless thick ligament inside your knee. It actually has a ton of detectors within it that feed your brain information about where your knee is in space, how it's moving, and when you have a tear, even if you have it reconstructed, it's never the same. It does not provide that same level of information. And that lack of information or the change in information provided definitely changes how you move. Yep. And it says you take that together with nociceptor activity, just means that you have pain in your knee. ACL tears, ACL reconstructions hurt a lot and cause inflammation. And those two things, the pain plus the inflammation, they also alter how you move. They alter how your brain decides to process information, and then execute movement. And then when you take all that stuff together, you're going to have a disruption in the back and forth between your knee and your brain and all this different ability to coordinate and execute movement. And I think a major place that this author's coming from is with brain neuroplasticity, for how your brain rewires in the presence of an injury and the recovery process. And I think he's trying to make the argument that you forever alter your brain function, and because of that, and because of some of those true changes in the tissue structure, you really can never go back to the beginning with. You combine those things, and it's better to say adaptation to injury, and true rehab and recovery is impossible for those reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this reminds me a lot of, I think some people might get upset when we say this, but chronic non-specific low back pain. Because there's a group of people that get pissed when you say non-specific, but I like it, and I'm going to say non-specific, and that's what the research says. So
truth hurts, dude. That's the way it is.
Truth hurts, yeah. But yeah, so anyways, this reminds me a lot of that. Like, how many times, it's every patient who has this chronic non-specific low back pain, that you have this conversation with them talking about kind of pain neuroscience and, neuroplasticity in the brain, even the peripheral nervous system, and just basically everything you said, and how things change in the brain. The brain adapts for better or for worse. And, in reality, I think some of the things when we talk about neuroplasticity, and like what you discussed there, Christian, about the ACL and, nociception and, different sensory pathways and all this other stuff, right? It sounds like it's a bad thing, It sounds like, oh, crap, like I just blew up my ACL. Now my I guess just to say my nervous system is screwed. Like all these bad changes, right? But the body physiology doesn't care about bad or good, right? Like it's not like the brain is like, you hurt your ACL, now you're screwed. Like I'm gonna make some changes here to show you. It doesn't care about bad or good. It just is. It's the physiology. It just changes, and so when we think about these adaptations that happen, it's like it's not bad or good adaptations. It's just adaptations, and so we can skew that in either a direction that we want it to go or a direction away from where it's going because we don't want it to go that way. But regardless, my original point was that this is something that we talk about all the time in low back pain patients, right? And you already brought that up earlier in the podcast, but we tell them like, hey, hopefully we find things here that can give you relief and management. And when you get a flare up in the future, which is probably going to happen when you look at the statistics and the research, here's what you can do to manage that flare up, because this is what the flare up is. The flare up is likely your cup of water is overflowing. I don't know if I should say this, but copyright Greg Lehman. Your cup of water is overflowing, and that's why now we're getting another episode of low back pain flare up, or at least part of it. So yeah, this whole idea of adaptation. Again, this is where I think we've been doing this. We just didn't have a name to it, right? We've been talking about adaptation versus maybe true recovery or rehab back to the normal. We just didn't have a name for it. And so, yes, this idea I think applies very well in this scenario, especially what you talked about after something like an ACL reconstruction.
One thing that also happens with ACL reconstruction, and I guess a lot of other injuries that I'll come to in a moment, is that there truly is a shift in how your brain processes information. So we know that in people that have ACL injuries, their nerve pathways from their knee to their brain get a little sleepy. They just don't work as well. They don't work as quickly. It takes more effort to make things work. And you can truly measure these kinds of things if you put sensors on their brain and you measure their motor cortex, you measure their somatosensory processing areas, and you can see these differences between people that had an injury or surgery, people that didn't. And the thing that's like, you might be like, okay, well, why does that matter so much? Well, first of all, for ACL injuries, people have a re-injury rate of, depending on what study you read and when it was, of like 22 to 30% re-injury within a year or two. That's substantial. That freaking sucks. You take a whole year off of your sport to do this massive surgery, massive recovery, only to re-tear the next year, either the same knee or the other knee. That's like a major problem. And it creates lifelong issues like early onset osteoarthritis 5 to 10 years after the surgery. And so it's important for us to look into these changes, especially from the neuroplasticity brain perspective, and see what changes there are, how long they're present for. Some of these studies I was reading, these changes are present in their brain for 5 years later. When these people were finally put into this study, they can still see differences between people that didn't have these injuries.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, so one major shift that happens with these injuries is going to be that people shift away from relying or using a lot of their sensory organs, so the mechanoreceptors, proprioception, kinesthesia, that kind of stuff that happens in the joint and the muscles and the tendons and ligaments. They don't use that information as much, and they tend to rely more on vision. And you see this exact same shift happen in the elderly, for example. The elderly are by and large deconditioned. Their bodies don't work as well, whatever reason, and they tend to rely more on vision. And when you get them in low light situations, or they just aren't wearing their glasses, I don't know what the hell's going on. They're just not doing stuff really well with their vision. They end up falling a lot. Or you get people with diabetes and they have neuropathy in their feet where their feet are kind of numb. They don't feel things the same. They tend to have poorer balance and different issues, and they rely more on vision. So when you take their vision away, like they close their eyes or they go into a darker environment, their balance goes to shit. And that stuff's pretty dangerous because they end up getting hurt. And when you think about the population, like ACL patients, young athletes, you take away their vision early on in the rehab, even later in the rehab, like 6, 9 months later, they end up performing way worse in certain motor tasks. And then what that sort of translates into over time is you get someone back on the field and now they're playing soccer and they're not looking at their legs, they're not looking at their feet, they're not staring at the ball, they're looking at all the different people coming after them, or they have to try to stop someone. And that means they are not focused on their leg. And what that then causes is them to perform more poorly with that leg, unless, which we'll get to in a bit, you focus on training that specific quality in people, where you get them doing challenging tasks in visual obstructed environments, in cognitive obstructed or cognitive loaded environments. And I'm going to let you now spitball on that, Eric.
I was smiling because I'm like, you are reading my brain waves currently on what I wanted to say. And
it's like we're in business together.
Yeah, holy I can't say that word. Yeah, I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I'm like, this is a perfect opportunity, Eric. Use your GD vestibular knowledge.
And it's actually a bullet point I left out.
Let's
say vestibular issues cause problems with balance and depth perception.
Yeah.
And you got to work on retraining your vestibular system.
This is great to talk about. I'm sitting here thinking to myself, let's talk about the umbrella of balance, right? We have three. Everyone thinks balance is like one thing. Balance is really an umbrella. It has three different legs to it. One of the legs is literally like our legs, our lower extremities, and talking about these peripheral nervous system responses, reflexes, when you talk about sensory organs within the tendons and the muscles and the ligaments, and they're constantly sending information to the brain in terms of where your legs are at in space and what's going on. And what happens is the brain uses that information to correct and keep yourself upright. Like, that's one leg. And then the second leg is your vision. And I give this speech all the time to my elderly individuals who have terrible balance. And we talk about how as you get older, we start to rely more on our visual cues, trying to be level with the horizon, versus our lower extremity cues, or the next one, which is our vestibular system. And the vestibular system is like a gyroscope, right? And so as you lean forward, lean back, side to side, the vestibular system is kind of like feeding the brain this input as to like where you're at in relationship to that like perpendicular point of gravity and kind of the ground and kind of where you're at in that axis. And so all those three things work together in order to keep us upright. And if you take away one of those legs, well, now you have to start relying on others more so, like the vision, like Christian talked about. And so training in that sense of taking away the vision, or making the legs having to work more difficult to send that information and keep everything up to date in terms of keeping you upright. Or we can work the vestibular system. And I do this with my athletes. And I don't know if you can tell, but I'm getting super excited about this because I don't think we talk about this enough. Like, I make my athletes or my post-op ACL individuals, meniscus individuals, people with ankle injuries or whatever it is, right? These more of the acute orthopedic things. I have them do a lot of what's called optokinetic training, or like taking in more cognitive challenging tasks while we're challenging the lower extremity in either like a balance, or if it's maybe like an agility drill, or whatever it is, because like you said, when they get back on the playing field, or your 35-year-old active individual wants to get back to playing volleyball in rec league or something, when they're doing that, they're not going to be thinking about both things at once, right? Can't think about the knee, can't think about the sport. And so it's this idea of working these different vestibular reflexes. I like to do a lot of optokinetic reflexes. There's a previous video podcast, if you go way back, where we talk about that. I remember talking about that podcast a little bit. But basically trying to integrate more of these three different legs of the balance system in order to have better motor control, improve balance, hopefully improve lowering your risk of re-injury. But yeah, no, I very much with you on that one there, Christian. I think this is where we can really see the alterations of the peripheral nervous system in something like a post ACL, and how that can affect things going forward, even after you're, quote, recovered from it, because all these things interact with one another.
Yeah, I want to bring this back to the original statement of adaptation to injury, not rehabilitation, where, especially sticking with the ACL reconstruction population, just because there's the most research on this population, but it applies to literally everything else, just maybe to different degrees. Traditionally, historically, ACL rehab has been about strength and conditioning and biomechanics and kinetics, kinematics. Just, okay, these people have these changes to their alignment and how their body moves. It seems more structural or biomechanical. We need to train these things with repetition and get them stronger, get them better at these different cutting drills, get them practicing sport drills, all these different things. And yes, that stuff matters, but placing too much of an emphasis on those ways of training does your client a disservice, because essentially you're training movements that no longer will work the same because of the change in their ACL. They don't have the same mechanoreceptors. And going back to what Eric is saying, you have to also address the other areas that are going to help them coordinate and help them function really well. You need to train all three of those different legs of the stool, not just the one that they seem, at least to you, the most efficient in, because you're trying to create compensatory adaptations in the other still highly functioning areas to make up for the deficits in whatever area got damaged. And so you can't just focus on doing pure strength and conditioning with an ACL patient. You can't just be like, oh, I just got to get you super yoked. We're going to do lunges and back squats and deadlifts, and then I'm going to get you doing, 30-degree cutting drills and 60 degrees and 90 degrees, and then, hopping and running and like just that stuff. That's not enough. It's not enough. It's not broad enough to elicit the requisite or required adaptations to make up for this person's deficits. And a common way to think about that in physical therapy is a lot of therapists focus on your impairments, meaning things that you're lacking. Are you lacking shoulder range of motion? That's an impairment. We posit that if we increase that range of motion, you're going to be better. Or you lack strength in some part of your body, if we increase the strength there, you're going to get better. It's like that's a very crude way of thinking. Not that it's wrong, it's just not always right, and often never the whole story. And so we have to make sure that we're treating these folks in many different realms, especially the areas that they need to rely on for compensation.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up too. It's not always just your glutes are weak and we need to strengthen your glutes and that's going to fix everything.
I wish it was that easy, dude.
I wish.
I freaking wish. Jesus. And sometimes it is. I'm not saying that's not true. Yeah. It is definitely true sometimes.
Yeah.
But not all the time.
Not all the time. Especially when you get into more complex things like chronic issues, right? Yeah, no, I think I like that point you bring up in discussing, like we've talked about before, it's not a bad idea to err on the side of caution and to get stronger. That's never a bad idea. And likely, I would say that majority of the time, the stronger you get, we can't correlate that with improvements and things like pain and whatnot, but I would bet that majority of the time things are going to get better if we can get you stronger. But like we said, that's not always the complete story. And we do clients, patients, athletes a disservice when we just preach this message that it's weak glutes, weak quads, weak hamstrings, weak all this other things when that's just the musculoskeletal system, or let's just go muscles. That's one system, right? We have various other systems that are interacting with this, especially things like the nervous system, balance, like we've already talked about. I don't get into this much, but vascular system and the immune system and all these other systems that interact with this area to make it get better. Strength and the muscles are just one part of it.
And this brings me to an aside around Greg's around physical therapy school. I know I warned you about this one,
Let's
Eric,
get
at the very
into it.
beginning.
We're 30 minutes in. Might as well make it.
Finally, yeah, I was getting a little sleepy. But um, the thing that people need to know is, especially older therapists, like, I don't know, I'm not going to say you're old yet, but like myself and people older than me who've been in this for a decade or longer, most of our teachings were around impairments and trying to figure out, okay, you do these tests to find these deficiencies in someone's range of motion or their strength, and then you provide exercises or treatments to make those things better.
Just treat the impairments, man.
Treat the impairments. Like if their shoulder hurts, oh, you found a lack range of motion in a certain direction. If you make that better, magically the pain goes away. I think that's, again, I said that's part of it, important, not the whole story. But that is a quick and dirty way to get a physical therapist started on treating. But a major issue that I found personally when I got out of school was that I lacked knowledge in three key areas. For being a quote-unquote movement expert, when I graduated school with my doctorate, I was like, I am no expert if I don't know these three things. So one area was exercise. Physical therapists by and large, do not get nearly enough training in strength and conditioning and exercise prescription, exercise programming, periodization, those kinds of things. It's not a thing that happens as much because for some reason, the American Physical Therapy Association does not think of it as being that clinically relevant to help people, and they don't make it a core part of the curriculum.
Even though, like, every CPG research thing you read, education and exercise is up there. It might not be the best, but it's recommended for almost everything, and for some reason, we just take it for granted. Anyways, keep going.
I think it's because they assume we all did that as our undergraduate major, and like, I'm sorry, I did molecular and cellular biology. I did not learn that at all. And so if you don't understand how to get people stronger, what that means in terms of less so about the anatomy and physiology, although some baseline is good, more a matter of like the actual nuts and bolts of it. Like, this is what you do, this is how you progress, this is why we do it this way. You have to know that. Sure, 3 sets of 10 and then adding more weight over time will work a lot of the time for people, but it's better that you know a lot more than just know that.
Yeah.
So that's one area is exercise. The second area is going to be pain. When people are in pain, they move different. If you do not know what pain is and how pain affects movement, I don't know how you're supposed to help someone get better. Like you can bumble your way through it, but if you don't understand that stuff quite well, you're doing your clients a disservice. And I did not get nearly enough education on pain and how pain works, how it affects someone's body, and that seems critically important to the topic of this podcast about adaptation to injury. And then the last one that I got, I think, zero training in was motor learning and motor control. Which, to break that down, what does that mean? Motor learning is how we learn how to move. Like, how does that happen in your body, in your brain? And then motor control is how we actually do it, how we like literally make the movements happen, like what the execution is like. And I'm sure other programs do this differently, but in our program, we did not learn this stuff. And it's like, how am I supposed to be a movement expert and help people learn how to move and be a really good coach if I don't even understand how movement works?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, when I look back on PT school, a lot of like our quote movement experts just came from our kinesiology class and learning, who's the person, I have their book. what's their name? Altenborn. That's who it is. Joint, yeah, just like learning like joint movements and all these different like ideas of like rolls and slides and just all, yeah, like that type of stuff. And it's like, oh, we're good to go now because we know the joint rules and we can now mobilize things and we know about, all these other stuff. Anyways, I'm sorry, Professor Lawrence. I'm probably doing a terrible job recapping this if you ever listen to this. But you're right, though. We don't really get that much in terms of motor control, motor learning. And I think it's because it's kind of a hard freaking topic to not only learn, but also probably teach. And I'm not, by no means am I wanting to like rip the professor's individual that taught me and taught you, right? That's not what I'm doing at all because they did phenomenal jobs with the topics of what they taught us. But I think it goes more at large, like you mentioned. I mean,
Coming from the top.
Coming from the top, dude. I'm exaggerating on purpose here, and I don't mean this. But, like, getting, like, your CSCS or something, dude, should that just be a prereq to get into PT school? Like, so that you can show that you have a solid foundation of exercise, that when you're hitting 6-9 months post-op ACL, you damn well can take someone through a solid return to sport, return to running, motor learning type of thing where you can get them going for sure versus lacking in some of that progress. I think that, obviously, again, I'm not saying people need their CSCS or something equivalent to that to get into PT school, but like, that helped me out so much as a clinician. Like when I was with you, my second clinical experience, right? Like if I didn't have that background of strength and conditioning from undergrad, I would have been scrambling hard to try and figure out what the hell am I doing as a PT or as a PT student. So yeah, I agree. The strength and conditioning background or teaching it or having a class on strength and conditioning. For example, in undergrad, like I took a class so I could take my CSCS. It basically prepped me for the CSCS, and that was a semester-long class. Like, first year PT school, teach that exact same thing, and then if PT students want, they can go and take their CSCS exam, get those credentials, and maybe, get into that line of work a little bit as long as being a PT. And I also realize that this is just one section of PT. This is orthopedic sports PT that we're talking about, right? Students that want to do cardiopulm or, lymphatics or neuro or peds, etc. They don't care about this probably. So anyways, we're just spitballing. But anyway, I agree though. I agree with that. And talking about pain, like going through PT school, like I came out and I thought just your anatomy equals pain, right? Like when I was first being told that having an acromioplasty, is that the right way to say it? When I was told that doesn't solve problems for subacromial pain syndrome, I was like, get out of here. They removed the bad part. They took away the bone that should be causing the quote impingement. Why is there still pain? This doesn't make sense. And that's because pain isn't just anatomy. So pain neuroscience. And we had a little bit of that in our neuro course. Like the first couple of weeks, we had like maybe 2 lectures, but it was more so on like the physiology of like how the peripheral nervous system sends signals to the central nervous system, which, by the way, I'm pretty sure that's just like a theory. Like it's not like proven. There's like several theories on how pain gets propagated up the nervous system, but we don't have to get into that. But like going through central adaptations and discussing central sensitization and like smudging of the cortex and like all these different ideas that like are very much in play, especially when we both know this. The majority of patients that we see, it's not just like, oh, I rolled my ankle playing basketball 2 days ago, or I had a knee hyperextension and now I, sprained whatever ligament in my knee, or like, it's not these acute things. Majority of the time, it's what's going on. Oh, I've had this shoulder pain for 5 years and now I'm just getting it checked out. There's going to be some central stuff going on there. And I think having that background is vitally important, but for some reason, throw it to the wind. And then lastly, you mentioned motor control, motor learning. One thing that I want to mention, and we got a little bit of it, but we just didn't get that in depth. It was like just a part of It was like 2 weeks a part of an intro class in PT school. But motivational interviewing, dude. And I know some people have gripes with this. Some people say that's just having a conversation with someone. I don't think that's the case. I think it's a very intentional way of trying to talk and interact with someone and trying to help elicit behavioral change. But having like not just 2 weeks of one course on motivational interviewing, a full-blown semester on motivational interviewing. That was one of the classes I had, and I mentioned this in the last podcast too. That was one of the classes I had in undergrad. That class, along with the strength and conditioning class I took, I think those two have set me up for, at least some success as being a PT after PT school versus a handful of things that PT school taught us. Like, there's things in PT school we had a whole semester on a class where it's like, why is this all of a grad level course? Like, we could be filling this time with so much more important things like a strength and conditioning class, a pain neuroscience class, motivational interviewing class, motor control, motor learning class. There's just so much other things that are just so vitally important that we use in day to day that we just don't, we get touched on. We get a little drip in the glass, right? Of just scratching the surface with these different things versus like getting into those. And it also, and people might, if we keep this in the podcast and people are listening, of like, well, then why is PT school not this way? And it really comes because of the board exam. The PT school teaches you things so that you can pass your board exam. That's basically it. Teaches you how not to kill someone, pass your board exam, and just the basics to get out there and start practicing. And all these things that Christian and I are talking about, these are all things that we learned on our own afterwards. Like, neither of us went to residency. Neither of us, had these things taught to us in PT school at this depth. These are just things that we learned from taking continuing ed, listening to podcasts, reading research articles, etc. But the reason why I believe this isn't in PT school as much as it is because the board exam is set up the way it is, and they say this is what a PT is, this is what a good PT should be, so let's pass this exam. So then PT school is like, well, I guess this is what we're teaching now. We're going to teach how to perform ultrasound at this certain rate, and we're going to teach about these mobilizations and how they apparently improve your joint mobility. When is it really that that's going on? It's these older ideas that we continue to have to learn and engrave into our brains from PT school, when there's so much other helpful things that we use as PTs that should be learned and taught and tested upon, versus these old school thoughts the PT exam board or whatever the hell it is keeps making us have to learn in PT school. And PT school can't change what they're teaching until the board exam changes.
Yeah, and why is this important? Well, it goes back to the title of this podcast, where in PT school you're taught how to rehab someone, how to quote unquote help someone recover, but you are not taught how to help someone adapt to their injury. And in the very beginning, I don't think either of us really said where we stand on that statement.
Oh yeah.
I like that statement.
I like it
makes
too.
a lot of sense. I think you mentioned that it exists on a spectrum, and I do agree with that, where like
Mm-hmm.
small sprains or strains are probably fine to think more about as rehab or recovery, but by and large, everything is going to need to be thought about as adapting to injury. I agree with the statement generally. I think focusing on impairments is not the best strategy. We cannot go back to how things were before the injury. If you had rotator cuff repair, the mechanical function of that rotator cuff is different. The way that your body coordinates movement of the shoulder and the shoulder blade and the spine, it's all different.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of changes that happen that are permanent. You can't go back and fix those again, and nor really should you. That's not really the point. The point is to move forward and adapt to these new changes, and ideally become better than before. Maybe not in the exact same way, though. That doesn't mean you cannot still be better. And just a simple way that I think of it is you just got to work with what you got. Whatever you have remaining, whatever systems are still there functioning, let's hammer those. Let's keep getting those, because your body, maybe this is true, but a phrase I've said for a long time is that your body is infinitely adaptable. Like you can train so many things in so many different ways, and it's ever evolving. And I think we just got to figure out how to lean into that. And going back to what Eric was saying, PT school just doesn't do a good enough job of that. And I think it's to your disservice, all of you clients, it's to your disservice. And Eric and I are trying to do our best to be better than that, and hopefully provide information to expose other people to these ideas.
Yeah.
But something that I wanted to try to wrap up with is, how do we put this adaptation to injury statement into practice? What is our general approach to this? And so I wrote down a handful of key categories that we can spitball between. So one is, definitely, I do think it's important for us to address your impairment. So if you do have clear strength or endurance or pain or swelling changes, I want to make sure that we are trying to address those in, maybe you would say, simple or rudimentary ways, like a generic exercise, like a bicep curl, or getting on a bike or going for a walk to increase your endurance, or helping your pain with things like massage or meds, and controlling your swelling the best we can, because all those impairments are definitely important and they will alter the way you move. And working on those impairments will help us on the path to adapting to your injury. So that's one thing. I also think going off of that, it makes sense for us to build general all-purpose capacity. And that's going to mean emphasizing movements and planes of movement, meaning like forward, back, left, right, that are relevant to the athlete, but not just doing those. That's called specificity, where you choose those based on the athlete and their intended use, but also challenging them in other planes of movement and other movements that they're not typically accustomed to. So for example, you have a runner, they go forward, back. Maybe you have them do some side lunges. You do some rotational work. Not just because you think that stuff is critical from some biomechanical perspective, but if they have an injury, a major goal of adapting to that injury is, when you think about motor learning principles, is adding a lot of new variety. Adding variety to movement, adding some randomness, those kinds of things tend to yield superior outcomes in people's learning of new movement and executing movement. Because it gives your body and your brain new exposures to provide more context to different problems that it's going to have later in life, in whatever you're doing. And so I think that you got to train those movements that are pretty similar to the task, like lunges, forward lunges for a runner, but also emphasize other directions to make them more well-rounded. And then one other major one I wanted to touch on was going to be, you need to improve their neuromuscular coordination. So Eric, he's very good at this with all his vestibular training and motor learning knowledge, and I don't do vestibular, at least not yet. Still probably won't.
Get into it.
But there's just too much to learn elsewhere.
Yeah,
Anyways, neuromuscular coordination just meaning you need to understand the principles of motor learning and motor control, and the best methods for coaching that we have to make these movements better, have people learn more of a variety of movement, with the ultimate goal of providing them better adaptation for whatever they're trying to do. And so that's where it's like things like guiding the athlete to find new movement options in a task, not drilling one specific perfect form for a movement. You need variety there. And we can achieve these improvements in someone's neuromuscular coordination through a variety of means. Like I mentioned earlier, you have randomness, making people do these tasks a little randomly, which could be as a topic for a different podcast, is one way to really do it. And then altering their constraints. I know I mentioned the constraints-led approach earlier today, but a simple example of that is, if you have a soccer player and you want to get them to explore new movement options to hopefully translate to the actual like real sport in a game, is like changing the game rules. So you change the rules from a normal field to a much smaller field. When you have a smaller field, things happen a little more chaotically, and that is going to lead to these people executing different movements. And then, to Eric's vestibular knowledge, addressing weaknesses in their coordination by taking out their vision, making them practice things with their eyes closed, or one eye open, one eye closed, using unstable surfaces, foam pads, wobble boards, things like that. And then adding cognitive load to a task. This one I think is pretty common in practice now, thankfully, but you have someone doing a balanced task or doing an exercise. You don't want them thinking about the knee, for example, to stick with the ACL. You don't want them thinking about their knee the whole time. You want them to have more of an external, outside the body perspective. And that's where having a cognitive task can help that, where they're going to be paying attention to something else while they're doing this movement, such as a memory game or a guessing game, things like that. And then also adding perturbations, which just means like we're pushing you around, we're just like trying to knock you off balance physically, and having you react to that and coordinate that, and then combining all those different things to make things even way harder. I think putting all that stuff together is going to be critical to helping people move forward. And everything that I've said is just combining those three major pillars that we mentioned of helping someone adapt to injury requires having a robust understanding of exercise science. You have to understand how pain affects people's movement, and you have to understand motor learning, motor control principles to truly get them where they want to be.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think another thing, I mean, that was a very solid breakdown. And just one of the things that I'll add to that is everyone's different. And like that's the other thing too, is like people are different. We talked about this in the last podcast, but like I'm definitely a little bit more of a chef than a baker when it comes to this stuff. It's like, how are you reacting to this as a patient, as a client? And do we need to sprinkle in a little bit more of this, or, you know, take some of this out of the equation, or give you a little bit more of that? And it's just playing around with these different parameters. And it's not like a hard, fast rule of, well, you have this, this, and this, so we're only going to do this. It's like, no, like we're going to start here. And if you're doing well with it, great, let's progress. If you're not, let's do something else. And that's where you kind of knowing these different ideas, being able to build the just general capacity or neuromuscular control. We've been going too long, and now Willie's trying to climb on me because she wants to play or get pet. You know, like those are all important things, so that we need to be able to play around with those. So because not everyone is different, and so we have to be able to kind of break the rules a little bit, so to speak, in order to get people better, because no one's the same.
Yeah, I guess the last thing I forgot to mention was you also should be adding in sport-specific things for the person. So like having the client actually train and do their rehab on a field or on the court, or you add a ball to their exercise drills to make it more context or sport specific, and even adding opponents, giving them some true physical obstacles that also behave like a human. Like that kind of stuff is going to help these clients adapt to their injury and not just recover from the impairments that they have. And it's like, this is all very difficult for us to measure.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, especially in our field, are like, yeah, but I need to measure these things. I need to know what's wrong and to what degree. I get it. I hear you. I want to as well, but we can't know all these things. And even if you wanted to know all these things, how the hell are you going to get all this information in a timely manner, in an affordable way? You're just not. Like, it doesn't work that way. I can't get everyone into a motion analysis lab with detectors and force plates and isokinetic machines. I can't do it. No one's going to pay me for that. And also, getting that information isn't going to dramatically change how we treat you, at least meaningfully. And so we're just wasting time and money. That's what the research is for, to give us these general principles. And so the way I think of it, and Eric too, is we take more of like a systems approach or a process-oriented approach, where we know all these different things are probably happening to some degree, and we're going to go looking for them, but we're still going to address them. We're just going to address them all. And you just might, like you're saying with the chef versus baker thing, is you might just emphasize one over the other based on your exploratory learning as you go along with this patient. Like, yes, I'm going to get you stronger no matter what. That's never a bad idea. I want to make sure you're hitting your endurance. But I'm also going to be looking for, how do you function? How do you feel when there's a cognitive load placed on you, or when there's an unstable surface? And then based on those findings and based on like how your strength is improving, I'm going to just shift the focus of our sessions. Generally, you know, I think physical therapists should be spending less time on strength and conditioning. That's just more of like a shift in my perspective as I've gotten older. That stuff is easy. That stuff is home exercise plan.
Yeah.
That's why we have our coaching service, if anyone is looking for that, where we will write you a very solid S&C plan, even in sprinkling some of these other things we're talking about. But when I have you as my patient in the gym, I'm not your personal trainer. I can be if you want me to be, but that's probably not the best use of my time, our time, and your money. I'm going to make sure that I get you started on the S&C stuff, your exercises, and I'm going to put that stuff for home as much as I can. And when you're in the gym with me or with Eric, we are going to be doing some of this higher level training that you can't do on your own. That's going to be looking at your movements, challenging you with new variety of movement, with some randomness, and adding in these different neuromuscular tasks like cognitive load, unstable surfaces, perturbations, visual changes, etc. Because
Yeah.
that stuff is far more meaningful and allows us to address more systems than just the like muscular strength, whatever type system.
Yep.
We're covering all of our bases to make sure that you're getting the best, most robust service we can give you.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And this is all just keeping in the frame of mind that we're adapting, right? That we're trying to create adaptations in the body. And so that's why we're pushing these different ideas. That's not just S&C, but it's good to go over that stuff and give for a home program. A lot of that stuff is going to be done on your own as the patient or the client. And like when we're together, if we need to go through stuff to make sure you're doing it right or talk through different movements, do some different movements, absolutely we're going to do that. But to just come in and, like you said, be a personal trainer, maybe not so much. There should be a better reason behind it than just saying we're going through exercises today. Again, that can be a conversation for a different time. But yeah, like you said, we're trying to provide these adaptations through these different things. And kind of going back to the original point, I agree. If we're looking at post ACL, yeah, we're probably not stepping in that same river twice. Your knee is a new knee to you. And, we're going to have to adapt and find your new normal. And I think a lot of people use that phrase, finding your new normal. If you roll your ankle a little bit and you're coming in 2 days after and it's just a light grade 1 and it's not too big of a deal, and then I would argue, yeah, we're going to probably be able to get you back to what you were before. And that little sprain is, after a couple of weeks, you're going to be good to go.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing I'll say is, I don't know if this happens to you, Eric, but like,
Yeah.
you just get random stuff on your YouTube feed, and something that I periodically get interested in is going to be arm wrestling. I don't know why. I just think it's fun.
I
It's so freaking cool looking.
haven't, but yeah,
you're
go
going to
on.
now that we're talking about it. It's certainly going to be blowing up on your YouTube
That's
feed.
true.
But I have this guy right now who he had a broken scaphoid, so a big major wrist bone, and his wrist is very stiff. He's pretty weak because he had to be immobilized in a splint for a while. And I assigned him classic like wrist curls, various directions, arm exercise like bicep, tricep for home. And when he's in the clinic, I'm working on his mobility, so I'm doing some hands-on work. But also, I've taken to arm wrestling him in the clinic, dude. It is so freaking fun, just going back and forth. What's cool about it is it's way less boring for me because I cannot watch a kid do wrist curls ever again. I just can't. It's so boring.
Yeah.
So
I hear you.
I've been arm wrestling, and what's fun is like I can grade the force in different directions,
Yeah.
And actually, when I was dealing with him last time, one of the sports med doctors walked in just to talk to one of the therapists, and I could see him looking over. He's like, "Is he arm wrestling?" It's like, "Hell yeah, I am, dude! Like, this is way more fun."
That's awesome.
And I talked to him about it afterwards. He was like, "That was actually pretty cool. Like, I like that." And I'm like, "Yeah, this is how we do it. You just got to have fun with it.
Yeah.
Add some more variety, add some more randomness, and keep it interesting for these folks. And they can do the S&C stuff at home."
Right. Yeah. Hell yeah, man. I like it.
Well, that's all I really had to say about this topic. I think we're going to be just under an hour. Perfect timing.
Yeah. I was going to say, we always manage to fill that time, but no, I thought this is a good discussion, and I think we went on some tangents, but it's all in good fun, and I think we touched on things that are relevant, but it always just comes back to that idea this snippet you sent me talked about, the idea of adaptation to like a new norm versus recovery or rehab back to your previous norm. And I think we both agree it lies on a spectrum. It depends. But there's a lot of different things that you can use to adapt and get better. Because like we said, the body physiology doesn't care if something's bad or good. It just is. So how can we influence that into favor what the patient or the client that you need or you want? Anyways, all right, man. Well, it is sunny and 80 degrees out today, so I'm gonna go and enjoy some time by the lake and get a little run in here and do some yard work. So have a good rest of your day, and thanks for the podcast, man.
All right, see you later, Eric.
See ya.